And welcome to week 8 of our course, where we're doing the other half of what originally was going to be week 7, namely Kant's moral philosophy, where we also start with an epistemological preface. I'm going to talk through this, prepare you for another 5-question quiz, and then next week we're going to do the midterm. We'll make up the missed amount of time, I think, in about week 12. So I'm pushing things back a little bit, but I will catch us up. I've just had to plan ahead from my original schedule a bit. So, just so you know, that's what's on the table. Okay, so with Kant, and in the reading that you've done, the first thing to note is this distinction between empirical or pure. Kant really wants to deal with what he would call a pure philosophy. Now, if you remember, this is really because of Hume. If you remember the Hume reading where everything is rooted in the sensation and the memory of the sensation, and thus you never really escape materiality, because your sense is a material thing, and a retained sense is still a retained material thing, right? Uh, just as your sense organ is, a physical part that has a certain arrangement or relationships amongst itself, whether it be physical parts in the ear or whatever goes in precisely to, sensing with your hand, etc. There's still there's a physical, very material component. And if all that your thoughts are just retained memories, some sort of keeping of the sense impression, then all you're ever going to deal with is that sense impression, finally. And remember, the problem with that Hume he points out really well, is that if you think that's what, thought is, which is what he thinks it is, then you never see causes. Not really, because you see changes in place, but they don't amount to a cause. The change in place does not cause one billiard ball to strike the other. It's whatever else, whatever even we would say, I would hope, it's mass or weight or various other factors, force, however you want to describe it. But you don't see those things, right? I mean, we're intuiting them in some way. But if all you really have are your senses and then some sort of imagination from that, senses and feelings, you don't really have sight of causes so much as an imagination of them. So, whether you understood that fully or not, the point is that Hume takes out of that you don't really know anything because you don't really see causes, you just make connections between things happening. And what Kant has to say then is, he would call that sort of knowledge empirical knowledge because it's rooted in, things that you see and sense, etc. But he's interested in what he calls pure knowledge and pure philosophy, which isn't gained from experience so much as what he thinks is a priori to experience. And boy, this is not an easy thing to talk about, especially not in an ethics course where we're not doing, Kant's epistemology. But what it would come down to is he thinks things are pure insofar as I said, they're in the mind before experience. Because you see, Kant's big push as a philosopher is to say, I get the sense data and this empirical data from my senses and feelings, but my mind takes that raw manifest data, manifold of data, if you will, and gives it intelligibility. And so philosophy for him that's pure is the knowledge of what gives intelligibility to the manifold of experience, to all these sights and sounds which you're internalizing. What gives structure and order to them? That is then what you know. And if you have any experience in like Platonic philosophy and the theory of forms, you could think of Kant's epistemology as really the theory of forms, but instead of having the forms be things that you know outside of the mind that are kind of like the perfect realities that all of your experience reflects in. He kind of has that same view, but it's in the human mind. The forms are in the mind. So we impress order and structure on our experience. That is Kant in a nutshell. Maybe a good way to make it sound not quite so crazy is to think about the fact that, you take in light waves according to the apparatus of the eye, and your sight is largely conditioned, another word he likes, right, your sight is conditioned by your eye, because it's according to your eye that you take, and its physical apparatus that you take in light the way that you do. He wants to see all of thought in those terms, except not physical. He thinks the mind kind of takes in, kind of sifts through your experience and gives it its structure and intelligibility, that which is known. So for Kant, he basically says to you, no, you can know things because you can essentially know your mind, which is a priori, that is before your experiences. Boy, I'd love to have a face-to-face conversation with all of you about that. I will tell you I'm not particularly convinced by it. The stuff we did very early on in the year suggests to me more that you'd want to take the mind, say the mind is, like Aristotle says, something that is able to take in the manifold of experience, if you will, and see the intelligibility in it. That there's reason or rationality, things to be known in the world, and what the mind is able to do is take what is there in a kind of potential and bring it into actuality in the mind. That will be to take the structure from reality rather than from your mind, which just makes a whole lot more sense, but also doesn't fall into the trap of Hume. So, all that's to say, again, if you don't understand that, it's not going to be a huge deal, because this is an ethics course, and I'm not. But I think it's important for understanding their philosophies. That's why I bring it up. But if you, to the extent that you have understood it, in a way, it shows you that you've kind of got three options. You've got Aristotle's option, where from your sense experience, knowledge is, the mind abstracts what is knowable from that. It's able to look at things and sense experience and take what is intelligible out of it. For Kant, it's kind of like you take that data and you impress intelligibility on it. Or you've got Hume, where you just don't have a principle of intelligibility, finally. Not really. Those are your three options. It's kind of fun to think of it in those terms. All right. Now, for Kant, then, what he wants to know are the a priori truths, that which is intelligible and which gives straight shape or structure to reality. So he's not interested in a empirical morality, one that studies things, for instance, to look at what he's saying on page 168 and 69 here, looking at looking at a culture and saying, okay, what's moral or seen to be moral in this culture according to the conditions of this culture. He wants to know, rather, what is unconditionally good. And by the way, I really like that focus. Even if you don't get the whole epistemological viewpoint, or if, like me, you think it's flawed, nonetheless, it is true. We want to think about what is good in and of itself, quite regardless of circumstances, for instance, or if there are, what is good without any conditions attached to it. And that's what he's interested in, because that would be a pure philosophy of morality, one that does not get tied down by particular circumstances that may accrue in a human life, but is really dealing with just the act in and of itself. And this is him further, I'm just saying this, he's trying to escape Hume's arguments by appealing to something that's not empirical, right? Insofar as you get away from the empirical or the sense perception, you're dealing with something that is now no longer tied down to this particular circumstance, this particular moment, at this particular time, in this particular place, but you're just dealing with the act considered in and of itself. Now, something is conditional if it depends upon something else for it to exist or function. So, if it's, say X is the case on the condition of Y, I will go to the store if you need something. The country approves our actions on the condition that we do not exceed the law. Okay, those are conditional statements, or statements in which there is a condition laid down. So if something is conditionally good, in this sense that we're using it, right, it's good based upon something else. So it's not good in and of itself. So what he wants to find is the unconditionally good thing. And he says the only thing that's unconditionally good is the will itself. It can also be bad, but the only thing that can be unconditionally good is the will, because we can use our intelligence for wickedness. We can use our judgment badly. And not only that, but being intelligent, not only could you use these things badly, but being intelligent makes you much more capable of wicked things, right? The person who is a very intelligent bank robber is much more capable of robbing banks than the one who's not intelligent. So they are good insofar as they aim at something good. Thus, they're only conditionally good. They're good on the condition of their use. Whereas for a will, he says, right, a good will is not good based on anything other than itself. So, um, he gives a whole list of things here, right? Happiness, as well as, I mean, by happiness he means comfort. He doesn't mean what Aristotle means by happiness. Um, he doesn't mean what you might mean by like beatitude or something like that, where you would be talking about a supremely happy life or something. You could use different terms, but he's using it more in the sense of comfort. But your comfort can inspire pride and often presumption, etc. Virtue, even like moderation in the affections and passions, self-control, may become extremely bad. The coolness of a villain makes him extremely dangerous. So coolness there in that sense of being able to undergo lots of pressure and intensity because they are very calm. A moderate person is made more capable of all sorts of actions, including bad ones. So the point is, insofar as your will is good, there's no condition upon, like a good, that good habit of moderation can be used badly. The good will, though, can't be used badly insofar as your will is good and is ordered to the good. There's no condition beyond it that defines it. So the person who wants to do the right thing just because it's the right thing, that person is acting well, unconditionally. The person who helps other people cross the street because it makes them feel good, well, that might be a noble thing in some way, and yet you say insofar as you're doing it so that you will feel good, you're actually conditioning your action. You're saying you're doing it not because it's the right thing, or not only because it's the right thing, but because you like what you get out of it. But if you do it just because you think it's the right thing, then you're doing something unconditionally good. Okay. He gives an example of the honest shopkeeper, right? If the shopkeeper is honest because he knows that in being honest he'll make a profit, that's not being honest for its own sake. You're doing it for something other than the sake of duty. Similarly, typically when you preserve your life, it's because you want to do something with your life. It's not just because you think it's the right thing to do, although I suppose in some cases if you're somewhat suicidal and you realize that's wrong, then you might preserve your life. Just because you think it's the right thing to do, etc. These are just typical examples that he gives us. Okay, so he wants to say, like, no, the first moral principle is that you need to do the right thing simply because you think it's the right thing. So you do it because you have an obligation to doing it and for no other reason. Now, this is just a quote that kind of captures that. Duty is the necessity to act out of reverence for the moral law. So doing the right thing because you think it's what you ought to do. Now, his way of then the real question is, how do I know that I'm living that situation? He says, well, this is how you know it. The categorical imperative. So it knows the imperative that is imperative categorically. He doesn't give it that phrase in the book, passages that we read, but he does talk about it on page 177. If you act always in such a way that the maxim that's guiding you could be willed to be a universal law of nature. Otherwise, you're acting for some reason other than pure duty, and your act will not truly be universal. Okay. What does this mean? Think about it this way. Whenever you do something, you've got a guiding principle. That guiding principle, what does that mean? It's a maxim. So, for instance, most generally here, good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. We're going to get that phrase from Thomas Aquinas. You're always going to want to do good and avoid evil. You're not going to be able to get away from that. Even when you say, like, I'm going to do evil, it's because you see something good in it, something desirable. Okay. That is a very general maxim, not particularly helpful for any given situation, but I want to give it as because it's so obvious there, I can say, I could will that to be, the guiding principle of everybody's action, such that it would be a law of nature. That would be desirable to me, that there was no breaking of that basic law. Or, more particularly, right, if you're really getting angry at somebody, and you want to strike them, but then you say, no, one should, that striking somebody just because you're mad is not sufficient reason for acting, or if you're really violently inclined, like, saying, no, this would not be in a case of self-defense, I shouldn't be becoming an aggressor here. That that is a guiding principle. You're saying there's something irrational in acting in a certain way, so you say don't do it or do X, Y, or Z. That is a maxim guiding your moment. And if you can will that to be the case for anybody, regardless of the circumstances, that you could will that it were as if it were a law of nature, like as regular as gravity, that it happened. If you can will that, then you're willing the right thing for the right reason. That's his guiding point. And you can see there's something nice about this, okay? Because this is a way, his practical way of trying to take you out of the equation and make you look at the act completely objectively, all right? I want to use that word because, um, if you could say, like, look, if I were to lie in this moment, and say, in an uncomfortable moment where, let's say your friend says, how does this hat make me look? Do you like this hat on me? This is a silly example, but it gets the point across, I hope. You could say, in the moment, I want my friend to feel good about themselves, and I don't think the hat looks good. If I say that, I'll make them sad, so I'm going to lie and say it looks great, and we'll move on with our lives. Excellent, okay. Now, if somebody does something like that, you can understand the rationale, okay. However, you can't will that to become a universal law of nature like gravity, because insofar as you would will to become a law of nature like gravity, it would become meaningless, right? If everybody lied to get out of a tight spot like that, or just for the sake of trying to make somebody else feel better, if that were a law of nature like gravity, well, then the person would know not to trust you in that moment, and your statement would become pointless. The lie contradicts itself. The will contradicts itself in trying to will that as a universal law of nature. So he would say then, like, you never want to lie because lying is never something that you could will to be the case universally, regardless of who is acting. You see how that? And by the way, you can. Kant takes this all the way. He would say you can't lie even to save your own life or the lives of others. Although he also wouldn't, he'd also agree there are times where you shouldn't tell the truth. He's not perverse in that way. But that would be a debatable point, but it exemplifies the principle here. Basically, you want to be able to take yourself out of the equation when you start talking about it. That's really what the categorical imperative is. He frames it two other ways: treat everybody else as ends in themselves, that is good for their own sake, and not just as means. Never use somebody. And the third way he gives it in other parts that we don't read is act for a kingdom of ends. What does that mean? It means you want your actions to be such that if everybody acted in these ways, in the ways that you're willing, you'd have a kingdom of beauty and good and truth, etc. Okay. So, I give this much easier example, right? When you choose ice cream and you go for a second helping, there might be cases where you'd think somebody should go for a second helping, but it's very unlikely, right, that you say, like, this is just the right thing to do. It's often you might want to do it just because you feel for you yourself the desirability of having more of that tasty goodness, right? But then if you can take out of yourself and just say, like, is this the sort of thing one should do in this circumstance? If you can really look at that and just completely ignore your own situation and your own being in that moment of choice and still choose it, then you know you're choosing it for the right reason. So that's the Kantian basic principle of all morality. um, I hope that's a good, nice, basic summary that should get you through the week. Kind of difficult reading of Kant. Um, but one that I hope will give a more relaxing week heading into what will be the midterm next week. If there are any questions about these philosophers, don't hesitate to email me. I wanted to note here, by the time you're listening to this, everything should be settled online. There was a little bit of a kerfuffle about the grading with regards to the fact that since I split up the assignment from week 7 and 8, there was only 5 questions last week and 5 questions this week. but the autograder was preparing for 10 possible points, then it was giving a goofy score. That'll be all corrected probably by the time you listen to this, probably before you listen to this. But regardless, don't worry about that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say. That's the main thing here. So I do sum up Hume and Kant here at the end. For Hume, because everything comes down to the senses and the sensation and materiality in that sense of the word, he has to reduce moral judgments to being based on feeling, right? Because the fact of incest is not worse in human beings than it is in animals, according to him, because it's the same sort of thing happening. Thus, the difference must be in the way you approach it, a kind of feeling. Whereas for Kant, ideas are not. He's saying no. You're not just approaching everything based upon some memory of sensation, but your ideas are actually a priori. There's a intelligibility to the structure of the mind that it even gives over to the manifold of experience. So he's able to really talk about law in itself. Again, for me, I wouldn't go either of those directions. I'd try to see intelligibility as being in things in such a way that you can abstract them out, but it's really a different point. Okay, have an excellent week, and email me with any questions. Cheers.